The strange thing about secrets is that they don't shout. They breathe quietly, waiting for the moment someone finally notices the change in the air. And inside a prison, where every door echoes, every footstep is observed, and every routine is predictable, silence itself becomes suspicious. Yet even in a place designed to monitor every movement, the most powerful shifts often happen in the smallest, most unremarkable moments. Moments that look harmless on the surface, but underneath them, something begins to tilt. The story begins in the sort of environment where nothing is supposed to change. A UK prison wing moving through its usual rhythm. Metal keys brushing against uniforms, faint chatter drifting from cells, officers in their structured routes, and inmates in their scheduled pauses. The atmosphere was steady, almost mathematical in its predictability. But somewhere within that routine, a tiny deviation appeared. First, too small to notice, then too subtle to question, and eventually too significant to ignore. Most relationships behind these walls don't begin with dramatic encounters. They start with something simple, a brief conversation during rounds, a polite answer to a question, a moment where someone feels understood even for a few seconds. These are exchanges that seem entirely professional, yet they carry a warmth that can grow in places where personal connection is rare. One officer had a habit of offering calm reassurance during tense moments on the wing. It wasn't special, it was her job. But for someone spending long hours in confinement, her steady presence felt different. It was the kind of presence that softened the harshness of the environment, creating a small island of normalcy in a world that rarely offered any. She didn't notice the shift at first. Most people don't. It began with polite greetings that lingered slightly longer than needed, conversations that stretched a breath past their natural ending, a smile exchanged during a routine check. It all felt harmless, routine, nothing worth overthinking. But inside a prison, where isolation amplifies emotion, even tidy gestures can feel enormous. Days turned into weeks, routines repeating with a subtle undertone. Shared moments grew more frequent. Brief chats near the exercise yard, light exchanges through the bars, friendly acknowledgments that blurred the line between duty and something warmer. No alarms rang, no rules were broken yet, but boundaries, once firm and structured, began to soften around the edges. Inside her mind, she explained it away. She was just being kind, just doing her job well, just making her environment easier to manage. That's how most officers describe the early stages. Harmless, professional, nothing more. But emotional connections rarely announce their arrival. They drift in quietly, threading themselves through daily routines until eventually they feel inevitable. For the inmate, the connection meant something entirely different, a sense of being noticed, a sense of being treated like a human being rather than a number. The dynamic inside prisons often magnifies even the smallest kindnesses. A simple question like, "Are you okay today?" can carry the weight of a full conversation. In that environment, it's easy for admiration to transform into something deeper. The officer, however, still believed she was in control of the situation. She believed she could offer empathy without crossing any boundaries. She believed she could keep the line clear between authority and emotion. But as their exchanges increased, she began rearranging her routine without meaning to. Taking a slightly longer route past his cell, slowing down her pace during evening checks, allowing moments to stretch beyond the usual script. Prison corridors have a way of revealing what people think they're hiding. Other officers noticed her pattern before she did. A moment too long spent near a particular door, a small change in tone, the slight softening of her expression when she passed by. These were details subtle enough to ignore individually, but together they formed a picture. But inside her mind, the experience felt far simpler. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't making any promises. She was just talking, just listening, just being human. That's the trap many officers unintentionally step into, confusing emotional comfort with professional responsibility. They don't see the relationship forming because it doesn't feel like one, at least not yet. As time passed, the inmate began responding with small gestures, being more cooperative, offering polite respect, keeping an eye on wing tensions to help her avoid difficult areas. Again, nothing dramatic, just behavior that made her job easier. It created a sense of trust that felt mutual, even balanced. But balance inside a prison is fragile, tilting the moment personal feelings into the equation. Her colleagues noticed shifts in her mood too. She seemed brighter on some days, distracted on others. Her reactions grew softer around certain individuals, firmer around others. She reassured herself that everything was fine, but her actions began revealing a different story. Emotional attachment doesn't require dramatic expressions, only tiny, consistent repetitions that slowly reshape behavior. Eventually, the connection became the quiet center of her workday, the part she anticipated without acknowledging it openly. She found herself thinking about their conversations even after her shift ended. She replayed small moments, convincing herself they meant nothing while also subconsciously investing in them. That duality, denial mixed with anticipation, is often the first sign that a boundary has blurred. Meanwhile, the inmate had grown steadily more comfortable. He understood the unspoken bond, even if neither of them named it. In a place where every interaction is monitored, he recognized the privilege of being treated differently. To him, it was obvious what was happening long before she allowed herself to see it. He didn't manipulate it intentionally, he simply followed the warmth being offered to him. The relationship hadn't crossed into rule-breaking yet, but it had already crossed into emotional territory. In many ways, that is where the real conflict begins, not with actions, but with feelings. Feelings that complicate judgment, feelings that quietly rewrite the rules people think they are following, feelings that create secret loyalties in a place built on structure and control. And in that fragile emotional space, quiet, subtle, completely human, the seeds of a deeper, rule-breaking connection were planted. What began as empathy had shifted into attachment, and without realizing it, both individuals were already walking toward consequences neither of them had imagined when the first small conversation began.
The shift was small, almost graceful in the way it settled into their routines, but beneath that quiet surface, the real story was beginning to take shape. Emotional attachment had already woven itself into the corners of their conversations, and with it came a new kind of risk, one that didn't announce itself with alarms or confrontation, but with small decisions that felt harmless in the moment. These decisions, though gentle on the outside, carried the weight of consequences waiting patiently in the background. The first digital trace didn't appear dramatically. It came in the form of an unnoticed glance toward a confiscated device during a routine inspection, a moment where curiosity and trust aligned in ways she didn't fully recognize. Technology inside a prison behaves like water. It finds cracks, slips into the smallest openings, and reveals more than it was ever meant to show. Hidden phones, discreet messages, and unseen recordings often become the quiet historians of choices people think no one will ever uncover. She didn't intend to leave any digital footprints, but intention is rarely the deciding factor when communication begins slipping into personal territory. A short exchange of words spoken too softly, a comment that sounded more personal than professional, a look that lingered half a second longer. None of it was captured on purpose, yet the environment around them recorded more than either expected. Somewhere along the line, a hidden phone in the wing caught a few seconds of their interaction. Not dramatic, not inappropriate, just noticeably warm. These small recordings have a way of turning private moments into evidence. Even a simple smile, when captured in a context like this, can reshape the meaning entirely. And in the digital age, it takes only a few seconds of footage for a story to shift from quiet connection to documented concern. But at this point, she had no idea such footage existed. She continued through her week, thinking she was navigating everything carefully, unaware that certain moments had already been stored in a device she didn't know was present. Technology inside prisons often feels silent, almost invisible, but its impact is anything but. Meanwhile, subtle signs began reaching the internal security team. Not warnings, just observations. Slightly longer pauses near a particular cell, conversations held in softer tones, a sense that an officer's routes seemed just a little too predictable. These weren't accusations, just early indicators. In environments built on constant observation, even gentle deviations accumulate like tiny puzzle pieces that eventually form a recognizable shape. Security teams didn't act immediately. They rarely do. Their process is slow, patient, methodical. They collect fragments quietly, the way a photographer captures small details before stepping back to see the whole composition. Their goal isn't to jump to conclusions, it's to understand the pattern. And patterns, by nature, reveal themselves slowly. As the days passed, the connection between the officer and the inmate continued its delicate evolution. They weren't exchanging anything risky. They weren't making promises, but they were communicating more freely now, letting conversation flow in ways that softened the boundary between them. A comment here, a shared thought there, ordinary words carrying an unspoken undercurrent. And the digital traces multiplied, not through dramatic exchanges, but through the simplest things. Moments captured on CCTV where her body language seemed more gentle near him, a slightly different expression, a more relaxed posture. These are the cues that technology registers without emotion, pure, objective, time-stamped. Inside her own thoughts, she still believed everything was under control. She believed no one noticed because it all felt so natural. Emotional drift rarely feels dangerous to the person experiencing it. Instead, it feels like a small refuge, something warm in an otherwise structured environment. But the digital world doesn't interpret intentions. It only records actions. Eventually, one of the security officers reviewing routine CCTV spotted a pattern, not suspicious enough to sound an alarm, but consistent enough to prompt curiosity. They saved a clip, then another, watching the progression unfold like frames in a slow-building documentary. Nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest a closeness no one expected. At the same time, a separate investigation uncovered a smuggled device on the wing. This discovery wasn't related to her, at least not intentionally, but when officers checked its contents, they stumbled upon short clips of everyday wing life. Among them, unintentionally, were brief clips featuring her and the inmate. Again, nothing overt, yet the tone between them was undeniable, a warmth that didn't belong in a correctional setting. This was the moment where digital trails and human intuition aligned. The internal team didn't accuse her. Instead, they began watching the situation more closely, reviewing more footage, listening to patterns in conversations, assessing the tone of exchanges during shift reports. Their job wasn't to punish, it was to understand what was unfolding and how deeply it had developed. Meanwhile, on her side of the story, she continued her shifts, unaware of the quiet investigation forming in the background. She still felt drawn toward their conversations, appreciating the sense of connection that had grown between them. The emotional bond she didn't fully name had become a familiar presence in her daily routine. She didn't realize how technology had already captured fragments of that connection, captured them in ways that would eventually form a narrative neither of them intended to create. Digital evidence has no tone, no context, no sentiment. It simply sits there, waiting for someone to interpret it. An interpretation was coming. As weeks passed, the review team noticed the subtle emotional thread woven through the recordings. They didn't need dramatic footage. They only needed consistency, something that pointed toward a relationship that had blurred boundaries without meaning to. And once the digital pattern became clear, the story began shifting from quiet observation to inevitable confrontation. She still didn't know. She still believed she had kept everything hidden within the unspoken confines of daily conversation. She believed the bond was private, contained, invisible. But digital traces rarely stay hidden forever. And the moment those traces were pieced together, the gentle, secret connection she thought lived only in conversation was now standing quietly under a brighter light, waiting for the consequences that the digital world never forgets.
The quiet pause that followed felt almost like the documentary itself was taking a breath, gathering its thoughts before revealing the final layer of this unsettling journey. And from that silence, the story moved forward, tracing the unseen paths these incidents carved inside the prison system. Because once a case like this surfaces, it doesn't end with a courtroom or a headline. It sinks into the foundations of every correctional institution, reshaping routines, reshuffling trust, and forcing everyone to ask uncomfortable questions about how something so serious could unfold right under the watch of an entire system. In the aftermath, investigators didn't just look at the individuals involved. They examined the ecosystem around them. Every relationship inside a prison, even the innocent ones, had to be reevaluated. Every conversation, every gesture, every moment where a boundary might blur had to be seen with sharper eyes. Staff who once moved through their shifts on muscle memory now found themselves second-guessing their surroundings. Cameras were reviewed more frequently. Supervisors paid closer attention to subtle changes in behavior. And simple human interactions, the kind that normally help build a healthy workplace, suddenly felt weighed down by suspicion. Yet beneath all these procedural adjustments lay a deeper, quieter impact: the erosion of public confidence. The public tends to view prisons as sealed environments where order is maintained with strict discipline. When a case like this emerges, it punctures that image, revealing a flawed and very human system. People begin asking if officers receive enough training, whether staffing shortages contribute to risky behavior, and if prisons are under more pressure than officials admit. These questions don't just live online or in newsrooms. They find their way into government meetings, budget discussions, and reform debates. A single relationship, once hidden in the shadows of a cell block, becomes a catalyst for nationwide scrutiny. For the officers still working inside, the consequences ripple through their daily lives. Morale dips. Many feel unfairly judged because of someone else's choices. They're asked to shoulder new responsibilities, sit through extra training, or adapt to revised protocols. Some step into their shifts with a renewed sense of caution, as if the walls themselves are listening. And while most officers maintain strong professional boundaries, the actions of a few cast long shadows across the entire profession. They must prove, day by day, that integrity is still the backbone of their work. Prisoners, on the other hand, are not untouched by these events. When boundaries tighten, privileges shift. Movements become more controlled, searches more frequent, communication more restricted. Even those who had nothing to do with the incidents feel the weight of the new environment. And conversations spread quickly, whispered interpretations of what happened, speculations about consequences, theories on how much staff knew. Inside closed spaces, information travels like a quiet pulse through the population, shaping perceptions and behaviors in unpredictable ways. But the most striking consequence lies in how these events reshape the narrative around power. A prison is built on an intricate balance, authority on one side, vulnerability on the other. When an inappropriate relationship crosses that line, it disrupts more than rules. It disrupts the psychological structure that keeps the institution functioning. The roles blur, trust falters, and the very idea of fairness becomes fuzzy. Officers who step out of line don't just break policy, they create confusion about who truly holds responsibility within those walls. And beyond the prison gates, society watches with a mixture of shock and curiosity. True crime documentaries, articles, and discussions bring these stories into living rooms across the country. But as people absorb the drama of secret relationships and exposed footage, they're also confronted with a crucial truth. These aren't fictional characters playing out a scripted scandal. These are real people in positions of authority, making choices that ripple outward, affecting families, colleagues, institutions, and in some cases, even public safety. Each documentary episode becomes a reminder that human nature doesn't pause at the entrance of a prison. It goes in with the people who work there, carrying all its complexities. The broader system responds with reforms, because such incidents force a kind of evolution. Policies might be rewritten to address gaps that were previously invisible. Communication guidelines become clearer. Technology is reviewed to detect prohibited devices more effectively. Mentorship programs arise to support officers facing emotional stress or pressure. And leaders emphasize transparency to rebuild trust both internally and publicly. Change doesn't happen instantly, but each case adds to a growing understanding of what must be strengthened. Amid all this, one truth rises quietly. The line between personal choices and institutional consequences is incredibly thin. A moment of emotional weakness or misplaced trust can unravel entire structures built over years. And that's why each of these cases matters, not because of the scandal, not because of the headlines, but because they expose vulnerabilities that must be addressed before they grow into something larger. As the story continues unfolding in the documentary, it becomes less about the individuals involved and more about the system learning to protect itself. It becomes a warning, a lesson, and a mirror held up to a world most people rarely see. And through that lens, viewers realize that the real story isn't hidden romance. It's the way a single breach reverberates through an entire institution, reshaping everything in its path with quiet but undeniable force.